so now we come to a wonderful scientific tool that's being used currently to tell us so much more about the past, occasionally disappointing us on our ancestral results, and that is DNA studies. Can DNA, or has DNA told us anything about the Philistines?
That's a great question, and let me give a little introduction. First, one of the big questions about Philistine material culture in general is how and where did they bury themselves? And up until quite recently, there were no clearly identified Philistine cemeteries. I always used to tell my students, there's one thing that we can be sure of, is that the Philistine died. We don't know where, though. But recently, at Tel Gat, we have a cemetery in which we excavated one tomb. At Ashkelon, they excavated a cemetery from the second half, from the Iron Age, not from the Iron I, but from the Iron II, and they excavated scores of tombs. And there's another cemetery which is excavated near a site of Tel Irani, which might be Philistine. And we have an earlier excavated cemetery at a place called Azor, which is not necessarily a Philistine city, but it's within the region that we would call Philistia. Now, only recently have we started doing advanced scientific techniques and analyses on the archaeological remains, which, by the way, is something which I'm sure any archaeologist that you speak to nowadays, one of the big revolutions of modern archaeology is this astounding toolkit of methods that, in the last 10, 20 years have become available, and we can utilize them. I like saying the difference between what I studied as an archaeologist in the early 1980s and what I can do now and teach my students is sort of like the difference between 19th century medicine and 20th century medicine, or 21st century medicine. We have the same objectives, but a completely different toolkit, and all kinds of things that we're completely in the dark about, we now have access to. So when we talk about Philistine cemeteries, by the way, it's not only DNA. We now have, for example, DNA and isotope studies and more advanced physical anthropology, which all give us a lot more information on the health, which, by the way, most of the tombs that we excavate of Philistines, but of ancient peoples in general, show us very clearly that, one, they died at a younger age, at a substantially younger age than we live today, and most of them had bad teeth and arthritis and all kinds of diseases that they lived through. And this concept that so many people have is just go back to ancient ways of life and everything will be great. Do it, but you'll die at 40 with aches and pains throughout your life. So it's that's a myth it's important to dispel, because there's this image of, just go back from modern times and 5G, which is causing all this horrible stuff, and we'll all be fine. That's new. Anyway, from the initial DNA analysis, both those in published and those are in progress, and I can't talk very much about those in progress, but we even have some more cool results for those in progress, but those have been published, show us that the population from a genetic point of view in Philistia is a complex, multi-origined group. It's not a monolithic group that came from one place and settled, but it seems to be a mixture of various people together in a mishmash. And I think the more we excavate, the more we analyze, the more we publish both the isotopic analysis and the DNA, we're going to get more and more of that. And it's a very important aspect. And again, that's only one, the origins is only one aspect. It's what they ate, what their health was, for example, using DNA, one of the things that we showed is that the pigs that we find in Philistia and in the land of Israel during antiquity, probably when the Philistines arrived, they brought with them pigs from Greece or from Southeastern Europe, and these pigs escaped. And nowadays, the wild boars in Israel, from a genetic point of view, are closer to boars in southeastern Europe than they are from boars, wild pigs in, not the boars B-O-R-E-S, but from boar in northern Syria and in Turkey. And that's probably because when the Philistines came, they brought with them squealing pigs in their ships, and that fits in, by the way. It's very common that people in ships bring along pigs for the simple reason is that a pig can eat all the garbage and sewage that's produced by the sailors, and in the end, you eat them. So it's a walking calorie bank, which also serves as a sort of like a vacuum cleaner. So it makes sense that they would have brought them along. And this goes for all kinds of other things. For example, study of the plant remains shows us that they come from a very, very complex and multifaceted origins, and it's not something coming from one area.
Very interesting. And that actually answers a question Morrow had asked, and that was if the high number of pig bones found at Philistine sites could tell us anything about the Philistines.
One of the things that we see very clearly is that with the appearance of the Philistine culture, there's a change in the diet and even the, let's say, agronomical practices in the region. And one of the things we see, for example, is that there's a rise in consumption of pig bone and also dog meat. We see both pig bones and dog bones with cut marks, clearly showing that they're being eaten. At the same time, we see that there's new types of plants which are brought to the land at the time, and the first utilization of local plants when previous had not been utilized, and also indications that there were change in methods of agriculture because new types of plants appear. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is, it's been very often stated in the past that a very good way to differentiate between the Philistines on the one hand and the Israelites, Judites, and the Canaanites at that time was who ate pig bones. And supposedly, abstention or taboo on eating pig was a very, very clear way of saying who was a Philistine, who was not. Now, that's really nice. It's to a certain extent based on extrapolating to later periods when Jews did not eat pig till today, in traditional Jewish culinary customs, you're not allowed to eat pig. And it was thought that this goes back way then. Now, the problem is that at some Philistine sites, they do eat pig. At some, they don't. At some Judite sites, they don't eat pig. At some Israelite sites, they do. So it's more complex than just yes, no. But that in general goes to the question of identity, and that was one of the topics that we wanted to broach is, how do you deal with identity based on archaeological remains? And that's one of the most complex issues in archaeology, and it's a very often, even with theoretically oriented archaeologists who are aware of the complexity, it's so comfortable and easy, cozy to get back to very simplistic definitions of 1, 2, 3, and 4. We put them in a box and that's it. Really, from an archaeological point of view, it's extraordinarily difficult to differentiate between various groups, to even assume that the archaeological record can do that, and to assume that there's only one type of identity. Just like nowadays we all have 6, 7 identities simultaneously running, and we overlap differently with different people in different groups. The same thing goes for the past. For some reason, archaeologists and historians very often emphasize ethnic identity, but that's only one of the types of identities. And then the big question is, can the archaeological remains actually tell us, and do the presence or absence of this or that find, a certain type of house, a certain type of bone, et cetera, does that tell us really black and white? And probably, it's like life in general. Things were not black or white. There was a lot of gray in between, and the gray is hard to differentiate. And for example, one of the best ways to differentiate people is not by the presence absence, but for example by their practice, communities of practice, what they did, and it's not always that simple to get that information from the archaeological remains. So, you know, if we're going back to touching on identity, it's very convenient to try to name these different groups and say, oh, Gath is a Philistine site, Jerusalem is a Judite site, etc. But once you start moving to the, you know, closer to the border between these entities, a lot of things are fuzzy, and it's much harder to define who's who. You know, and I think that's a big one. For example, the pig bones, that connects to that issue.